Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Now TV and Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma, and I hope you're having a fantastic week. Hope you're healthy. Hope everything's going just great for you. And I want to thank you so very, very much for joining me here. Yeah, still having a tough time. That respiratory infection that my wife and I caught recently, it just it just flat doesn't want to turn loose. I've been trying to take it real easy with my voice. Unfortunately, I've had to do a lot of extra filming, however, and so that that's not necessarily good when the voice is weak already. So anyway, listen, this month is almost over, and as I announced a couple of weeks ago on my morning musings, I am introducing my brand spanking new book that has been so long in production and what have you. It is entitled, as you can see, Resurrection Feast Fulfilled. It is a study of the connection between Israel's final feast day, known as Sukkot, and the resurrection. Look, folks, I don't know of another book that comes even close to this. This is an investigation of what did the Feast of Harvest. Sukkot was known as Feast of Harvest, Feast of Ingathering. It was called the Joy of the Nations. It was called the Feast of Our Joy. Pardon me, and on and on. Many different names, all of which I list in the book here. The book is over 470 pages long, contains an absolute wealth of information focused on, even though I discussed some of the other feast days, but it's focused on the significance, the typological, the prophetic significance of the feast day called Sukkot, as it pointed to the new creation, as it pointed to the resurrection. And here's the reality. Old Covenant Israel would remain as God's chosen people as long as the feast days would remain valid. The last feast day symbolized, foreshadowed, typified the resurrection. If, therefore, the resurrection has not taken place, you know what that means? Point number one, it means that Israel is still God's covenant people, and it means that the law of Moses remains fully valid today. Because you see, the law of Moses contained, mandated, commanded all 7 feast days. Leviticus chapter 23, Numbers chapter 28. So you can't have a future resurrection, a future judgment, a future coming of the Lord, all of which were typified and foreshadowed by the feast days. You can't place those things off in the future without saying that the feast days are still valid. But if the feast days are still valid, the law of Moses is still valid. Do you see the problem here? This is one of the reasons why, ladies and gentlemen, and by the way, in my regular morning musings that I do Mondays through Wednesdays, I will be initiating very, very soon a very special study of all 7 of the feast days of Israel, their significance, their typological meaning, what they meant not only to Israel but to the nations. And it's important, you see, because not only were the feast days given exclusively to Israel, but they had implications for the nations. And many people don't understand that. Okay, so I'm extremely excited. I'm officially introducing this. If all goes well, okay, I'm waiting on the publisher to okay the format, to okay the layout, to okay the margins, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, so that I can proceed with publication. My target is the 1st of November, which you know is obviously just around the corner here. So be looking for this. In the month of November, if all goes to plan, I will be offering a great introductory price on this book, and I'm going to cut costs as low as I can, I guarantee it's going to cost me a lot of money per volume to publish this book, more than any other book I've ever published. But I think you're going to love it. I think you're going to agree with me. This is incredible material. So be looking for that. All right. Pardon me. As I promised last week, as we continue our examination of the doctrine and of the idea of the challenge of Christ. What is the challenge of Christ? Let's be reminded of that very briefly. John chapter 10, verse 37, in which Jesus said, "Do not believe me for my words' sake, believe me for my works. If I do not do the works that my Father has given me, do not believe me. Believe me for my words," or works, Jesus was saying. So this is so incredibly important. Just over the last month, I have been engaged in discussions, private discussions, with atheists, with unbelievers, with skeptics. Well, everybody knows Jesus didn't come put an end to the world, the argument goes. And of course, I have rejoined, Jesus never said he was going to come back and put an end to the world. He said he was going to come back at the end of the age, the end of the old covenant age, not the end of the endless Christian age. This is such a fundamental fact. And yet it is ignored or unknown by the great majority of believers today. So one of the ways that I've been approaching and demonstrating the validity of Scripture, the reliability of Jesus, the reliability of his apostles in the New Testament writings, is by showing that Daniel 9 foretold 6 constituent elements. 6 constituent elements that would be fulfilled at the appointed time. Daniel, more than any other book in the Old Testament, spoke of an appointed time, the appointed time of the end, as Daniel chapter 12, verse 3 expresses it. That appointed time of the end was in the days of the Fourth Empire. The Fourth Empire of Daniel chapter 2 was the days of Rome. The coming of the Son of Man in judgment of the little horn was likewise to be in the days of the Fourth Empire, which was the days of Rome. The appointed time, you see. Daniel chapter 9 set the appointed time, the time of the end, the time of the making of the atonement, the putting away of sin, the finishing of transgression, the bringing in of everlasting righteousness, which is nothing less, nothing other than the time of the resurrection. All of that was to be fulfilled by the end of the 70th week of Daniel chapter 9. So, what do we have? We have this concept of the appointed time. Now, I posed this question to you a couple of weeks ago. How would it be possible for Daniel, writing hundreds of years before the time of Jesus, and yes, I take the early dating of the book of Daniel, but how would it be possible for Daniel to predict the time and the events for the coming of the Messiah, both his incarnational work and his eschatological work? And it just, by strange coincidence, here comes Jesus doing the very things that Daniel foretold hundreds of years beforehand. Is that just strange coincidence? Is that lucky coincidence? Well, you know it's not. Daniel was a prophet of God. He predicted by divine inspiration the things that were to come and to constitute the last days. Jesus came in the last days. Hebrews chapter 1, verse 1 and 2. There's perfect correspondence here, ladies and gentlemen. And so, what I've been sharing with you is how when we look at the constituent elements of Daniel chapter 9, one of those key constituent elements is 70 weeks were determined to seal vision and prophecy. Or more accurately, to seal vision and prophet. What did that mean? It meant that by the end of the 70 weeks, And by the way, I've written a book on this, Seal It, Vision, and Prophecy. It's available from my bookstore. I wish I could offer free shipping on it, but the shipping rates have gone up. Publishing rates have gone up. I cannot make that offer for you, and I do apologize. But go to my bookstore, www.bibleprophecy.com, DonKPreston.com. Go to the bookstore, order the book, Seal It, Vision, and Prophecy, and order that book. Listen, folks, you'll be astounded at how clear the evidence is. You'll be astounded at how widely biblical scholars agree that the terminology seal, vision, and prophecy refer to the consummation of the prophetic office by the fulfillment of all prophecy. It's astounding how widely scholars agree on that. So, I've been sharing with you how the New Testament writers, the New Testament prophets, likewise spoke of the time in which they were living, as the time for the fulfillment, number one, of everything that the Old Covenant prophets had spoken. In 1 Peter chapter 1, 10 and 11, in writing of the salvation, the reception of the eternal inheritance that he had been writing about, 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 3 and following, he said, concerning this salvation, the prophets, that's the Old Testament prophets, have inquired and searched diligently to know the time and the manner of the things of which they spoke. To whom it was revealed that not to themselves did they minister those things. In other words, they weren't to those things were not to be fulfilled in their time. Which, by the way, real quick digression here. When Peter says the Old Testament prophets were told that the last days events were not for their day, that kind of destroys the argument made by those who oppose covenant eschatology, who say, oh, well, the end is always near. The day of the Lord is always at hand. Well, if the Old Testament prophets spoke of the last days, and they spoke of the last days, day of the Lord, all of which they did, then since Peter says the Old Testament prophets were told those events were not for their day, then it is simply specious, it's fallacious, and it's wrong to say, oh, well, God doesn't talk in time like we do, and the day of the Lord is always at hand. See, those are contradictory statements. They didn't know when those things were to be. They were told they were not for their day versus, oh, it's always at hand. No, it's not always at hand if it was not for their day. So that just illustrates the argumentum ad desperatum of the enemies of the full preterist view. Okay, so what I've been sharing with you, what I touched on last week, was the concept that the New Testament writers tell us when all things written were to be fulfilled. One of my newest books, in fact, the newest book, except for the one that I just told you about, is these are the days when all things must be fulfilled. That's what Jesus said, and speaking about the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. These be the days of vengeance in which all things that are written must be fulfilled. Now, some people tell us, well, all that he had in mind there was Old Testament prophecy. Well, I agree with that. But that's fatal to the futurist view. Because you see, the Old Testament foretold coming of the Lord, the judgment, the resurrection, the kingdom, the new heaven and new earth. So when people argue and when they admit that all things written in the Old Testament were to be fulfilled by the time of the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, they're admitting, guess what? Coming of the Lord, judgment, resurrection, kingdom, new heaven, new earth, all happened by the time of the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. Folks, you just got to catch the power of that. I mean, it's incredible how powerful this is. And by the way, in this book, I examine, I respond to, and refute every major objection that I've heard that has been offered to Luke chapter 21, verse 22, being the time of the fulfillment of all things written. So if you've got an objection to that being what Jesus was saying, you need to get this book. And you know what? If If you've got an objection that I'm unaware of, that I wasn't aware of at the writing of this book, and believe you me, I've been at this a long time, but hey, maybe you got something new. Okay? So, if you've got an objection, then go ahead. Go ahead and contact me and say, Don, I think you're mistaken on Luke chapter 21, verse 22. Jesus wasn't talking about all things written because. Share your thoughts with me. All right. Now then, as promised in the time left to me this morning, I want to go right straight to Revelation chapter 10 and chapter 11, because as I promised last week, I want to show how Revelation 10 and 11, just like Luke chapter 21 and verse 22, was predicting the time for the fulfillment of all prophecy. Now, to set the stage for a presentation this morning, let me ask you, is the time of the resurrection, the time in which all prophecy would be fulfilled? Now, remember, the time of the resurrection is the time of the arrival of the new heaven and new earth, of the new Jerusalem. So, number one, I am unaware of anyone of any eschatological paradigm who would try to insert a long period of time between the doctrine of the resurrection and the doctrine of the new heaven and the new earth. I just don't know of anyone. Everyone agrees resurrection brings in, it ushers in the new heaven and the new earth. By the way, which is perfectly consistent with the Jewish narrative of eschatology. The Jews believed Elijah would come, you'd have the Great Tribulation, and at the end of the Great Tribulation, you had the coming of the Lord and the resurrection, which brought in the new heaven and the new earth. That was good Jewish doctrine. But guess what? That's the New Testament doctrine. That's the Old Testament doctrine as well. So, with that introductory comment, that is, everyone agrees, resurrection, bringing in the new heaven and earth, is the time of the fulfillment of all prophecy. No prophecy needed after that. No prophecies made after that. Time of the resurrection, new creation, is the time of the fulfillment of all prophecy. Therefore, the end of the prophetic office. Okay, so with that in mind, we go to Revelation chapter 10 and verse 7. Now, prior to chapter 10, we have the sounding of 6 trumpets. In the sounding of the 7th trumpet, or we're told that in the days of the 7th trumpet, as it was about to sound, John saw or heard an angel say that in the days of the sounding of the 7th trumpet, the mystery of God, as foretold by the prophets, will be fulfilled or will be finished. Well, folks, this is precisely what Luke 21 verse 22 says. Luke 21:22, the time of the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70 would be when all Old Testament prophecy was fulfilled. That's Kenneth Gentry's view, by the way. Kenneth Gentry, calling preterists naive and ignorant, in commenting on Luke chapter 21 and verse 22, Kenneth Gentry said what the preterists failed to recognize is that all that Jesus was saying in Luke chapter 21 and verse 22 is that all, these are his terms, folks, all Old Testament prophecy would be fulfilled by AD 70. Now, that's his view. I didn't make it up. If you want documentation, contact me. I'll give it to you. So here's Kenneth Gentry stating that by AD 70, all Old Testament prophecy would be fulfilled. You know, it's really obvious Kenneth Gentry was just reacting, knee-jerk reaction to the preterist argument. Kenneth Gentry believes the Old Testament foretold the resurrection. On Isaiah 26, for instance. Isaiah 25:8, for instance. And yet here he is in the desperation mode to refute covenant eschatology. He says Jesus was saying that all Old Testament prophecy would be fulfilled by AD 70. Listen, he didn't qualify it. He didn't say all Old Testament prophecies of the fall of Jerusalem. He said all Old Testament prophecy. So here we have Luke chapter 21, verse 22 saying, all things found in the Old Covenant prophets would be fulfilled by AD 70. Now we have Jesus communicating to John through the Spirit that in the sounding of the seventh trumpet, what would happen? The mystery of God foretold by the prophets. Same thing. You know, all things written, Old Testament prophet. The mystery of God foretold by the prophets. And folks, Revelation chapter 10, verse 6, is not talking about different Old Testament or different prophets from what Jesus was talking about. He wasn't talking about new covenant prophets as if they had a different eschatological message from the Old Testament prophets. The New Testament writers, and I'm running out of time so quickly here, the New Testament writers and speakers are emphatic in telling us that their eschatological hope was nothing but what was found in Moses, Samuel, and all of the prophets who have ever spoken when they spoke about the restoration of all things. Well, what's the restoration of all things? Oh, it's the new heaven and new earth. That would come at the time of the resurrection. You see? And so we have perfect correlation between Luke 21, 22, and Revelation chapter 10. Revelation chapter 10 is saying the mystery of God foretold by the prophets, the Old Testament prophets, would be fulfilled. Now, a little caveat here, okay? Number one, if it is true that Revelation chapter 10, 6 and 7 is talking about the fulfillment of all of the Old Testament prophets, and I'll show you that it is, that'll probably be next week now. But if therefore I'm able to demonstrate that Revelation chapter 10, 6 and 7 are talking about the fulfillment of all Old Testament prophets, guess what that means? It means the resurrection has taken place. It means the judgment, Yom Teruah, has taken place. It means the coming of the Lord, the parousia, has taken place. Because you see, you can't separate those concepts, those ideas, those motifs from Israel's feast days. Daniel 9, as I've shared with you before, is saturated with festal imagery, festal language, essentially saying all prophecy will be fulfilled when Israel's feast days are fulfilled. Okay? Now, like I said, I got to get down to this. Here is John being told, Revelation chapter 10, that the mystery of God foretold by the prophets would be fulfilled in the sounding of the seventh trumpet. As I mentioned, there's a little caveat that is offered by some people. It is a view that I once held myself, ladies and gentlemen. I went there and I saw the reference to the mystery of God. Well, you see, the mystery of God is defined by Paul, at least partially in that context, as Jew and Gentile equality in the one body of Christ. Ephesians 3, 3 through 7. Now, I don't categorically reject that view even now. The way I've changed my view is Revelation chapter 10 is focused on eschatology. And while I still believe that the mystery of God, i.e. Jew, Gentile equality in one body in Christ, would be manifested by the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, it's not limited to that. And again, I'll demonstrate that beyond a shadow of a doubt next week, undeniably. So what do we have, therefore, in Revelation chapter 10? Well, verse 6, we have the promise of the fulfillment of the mystery of God foretold by the prophets. And John says that he saw one angel standing on earth standing on the sea, lifting his hands up to heaven and saying that in the sounding of the seventh trumpet, not only would the mystery of God be fulfilled, but he said, there shall be no more time. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I was stunned years ago when I still believed that the Bible talks about the end of time, when I realized that is absolutely not what John was predicting. You see, in the sounding of the seventh trumpet, you have the outplaying. You have this trumpet sounding. Then, a little bit later, not millennia later, but a little bit later, the sounding of the next trumpet. Then the next trumpet. Then the next trumpet. We're often told there would be no more time between this trumpet and that trumpet, because the next trumpet would sound quickly. So what we have in Revelation chapter 10 verse 7 is not John being told in the sounding of the seventh trumpet there's no more time. Even G.K. Beale, in his massive commentary on the book of Revelation, says the end of time is not in the discussion of Revelation chapter 10. That is an ideological view that is not in the view of Revelation chapter 10. The meaning of the text is, there shall be no more delay. Do you catch the power of that? No more delay in the fulfillment of the mystery of God. Listen, the mystery of God found in the Old Testament, resurrection, judgment, coming of the Lord, new creation. The mystery of God was made, predicted hundreds of years before John. It had been, quote, delayed, not as in postponed at all, but simply through the passing of time. But now the declaration is, at the sounding of the seventh trumpet, all prophecy would be fulfilled. That is to say, there would be no more delay in the fulfillment of all prophecy. I'm out of time. I'll have to pick this up again next week and to show you definitively what John is being told. See you there.